Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we got another unscripted movie review, this time of the newest film from Disney, Christopher Robin. So as a critic, one of my biggest struggles, but one of the things that I find most rewarding about this whole thing is an understanding of my unconscious biases. I've got my conscious biases, things that I like to see and that I'm very conscious of that inspire some level of thought. But what I find really fascinating for me are the elements that might inspire me one way or another in art that are unconscious, that trigger that emotional reaction. And one of the things that draws me to being a critic is being able to understand and contextualize what those triggers are, if only to further understand the elements of my psyche that would contribute to that. It's more introspective and kind of pretentious, sure, but I think there's real value in that in terms of decoding how I would see and contextualize art, and maybe even provide a little bit of context to how others could have that similar emotional reaction based upon specific things. But there's another level to this, and the sort of level to which for a lot of people becomes a little discomforting to talk about, but it's the acknowledgement that there's going to be some things that are so formative to your psyche, you really can't contextualize them in the same way. You might grasp certain underlying parallels in theme or emotion or texture, but you know it's more resonant, you know it runs deeper, often because you were exposed to it so young, where it almost becomes fundamental to how you see the larger world. So I'm looking at something like Land Before Time for me, or The Shining Time Station, which was the Thomas the Tank Engine series, and for me a big one was Winnie the Pooh. And I mean this going back to when I was like 3 to 5 years old and extending to, well, now. I've always had an affection for the series. There's this low-key, shaggy texture to it that's almost kind of placid, but there's a level of calm and quiet reserve to the series that I've always found incredibly charming, and just really speaks to a larger aesthetic conceit that just resonates beyond anything I can really properly contextualize or put into words. It just gives you that sense of peace in childhood. And thus, when I saw that there was going to be a movie, when I saw that there was going to be trailers for a movie centered around an adult Christopher Robin going back and recovering and re-exploring the characters of his childhood, where it be it Pooh, Tigger, Rabbit, Piglet, Eeyore, the whole family there, you almost realize that there is no possible way I could be completely objective talking about this movie. Unless it was a complete catastrophe, and this is by far not that. There was going to be no way I wasn't going to walk out of this saying, oh my god, this is absolutely spectacular, regardless of what any conscious emotional response that I might otherwise have. I was going to say it's going to be one of the best movies of the year regardless. It's just that formative to my psyche. And don't believe me, because this is not just me as a critic. Go to so many people and talk about the other big movie that spoke to childhood in that case is Won't You Be My Neighbor, the story of Mr. Rogers, and how much that resonated with some people. And one movie I'm not sure I could sit through, if only because they might have that same level of resonance. This being more a fictionalized adaptation, it was a little bit easier for me to approach. But my god, it got so much right. It did exactly what it needed to do, and it did in a way that I almost wish the Paddington movies had stepped more in this direction. The plot is very low-key, very restrained. If anything, if I were to point to a singular flaw in this movie, but it kind of needed there to be there for momentum, is that there is much of a plot at all surrounding Christopher Robin and his larger, any sort of stakes. So the story is, he's left the 100-acre wood behind, he's left those preschool ideals behind, and he's had to grow up. And what I love about the movie, immediately, right out of the gate, is that it leaves so much implied. There's nothing that's said that can be shown. And that's one thing that I appreciate so much about this movie, is that while it could go for madcap zaniness that you saw, the very plainly wholesome stuff that you saw in the two Paddington movies, Winnie the Pooh is more restrained, is letting the dialogue, letting the free-flowing atmosphere tell a lot more of the story, and leave a lot more to texture and feel, and Mark Forster's excellent direction in this film. And as such, you get a lot of muted color palettes. You see a life that was very much aged going forward. You see Christopher Robin having to experience his first love, you losing the loss of his father almost suddenly from boarding school, and you can tell there was a complicated feeling of distance there between that father figure. How he meets his future wife, Haley Atwell, who also does a very good job in a very tough position that she has to play. And then she has kids, and then he goes to war, because this is partially tied around World War II. What is left unsaid that Ewan McGregor, playing Christopher Robin, has to convey is truly stunning, the levels of subtlety as that adult character returning to a childhood experience that was indeed so formative for him. And of course, you got Jim Gaffigan once again lending the voice as Pooh, and it's just wonderful. In managing to capture that slightly almost baffling, a little befuddled waddling around that he always does, but being able to capture a true winsome wholesomeness that ties into the character and the deep connection that he has to Christopher Robin, even that Christopher Robin has tried to bury it so deeply as the adult in this world. And yeah, there's been some criticism of the plot, saying that it's basically a Hook-style plot, a grown-up man trying to find his inner child again. But I'd say there's a lot more subtext there going on. Take a look at certain scenes where he encounters more of Pooh, and it's just him and Pooh bouncing back and forth. Because there is an acknowledgement of that absurdity and lightness of tone that needs to come back to his life, but there's also so much implied beforehand that because of what Christopher Robin experienced, potentially just having to get the job, having to wrestle with the loss of his father, and now being a father himself, and the implication that there might be something left over from the war that might have partially reinforced the distance that he might now feel with his wife and daughter. There's a lot not being said that's conveyed through subtext and acting, where Ewan McGregor really has to give a tremendous performance, because he's acting against CGI effects, really wonderfully exercised CGI too, with so much warm texture and lived-in elements that I really appreciate. There's so much that's not being said that it relies upon the audience, specifically a more adult audience, to clue in to the subtext, the underlying singles, the emotional through currents of empathy that run through the film. And Marc Forster is such a deft hand in capturing both the deeper levels of trauma that might potentially run through Ewan McGregor's character, but also how painful it can be, how difficult it can be to recapture that inner child when that child has been buried so deep, and when faced with the crushing weight of adult responsibilities. What I like about this movie is that it doesn't dance around the fact that there are those deeper consequences that he is going to potentially have to face in the long term. Yeah, I will say the plot is a little light, a little low stakes, only they're really there to provide any sort of momentum for the film, but you kind of need that. And I kind of appreciate that there is that weight that's carried through the most of the film, especially when you're having him opposite someone like Mark Gatiss, who is playing a Mark Gatiss character in the arguable antagonist of the film. But at the same time, it's also, you can see his point of view coming in as an adult character, having to see a very complicated world. And again, I could always point back to the rest of the Pooh characters in that family, especially Eeyore, who probably nets the most laughs, if only because of the downbeat depression. How there's not emo Eeyore memes everywhere, I have no idea, but I guess it's a little bit too pure, a little bit too wholesome. And there are plenty of callbacks, especially if you're familiar with the Winnie the Pooh mythos as a whole, but coming back to the earlier films, that I'm really impressed that the movie brought in a way that did feel elegant and not overstated. That was really charming to me. Guys, I just fucking love this movie. It got to me in a way that only films that get both the actual clearly thought through metaphors that's expanding through, that we're telling a story, but are composed and smart enough to rely upon low-key texture and subtext and really phenomenal direction, and be able to draw those connections instead of having to go for madcap zany energy. People might draw the plotline comparisons to Hook, but really Hook was way more wild and slapdash, where Christopher Robin doesn't need to be, and I really did appreciate that. Now, admittedly, part of this does come from the fact that it was so formative for me. I freely admit that if you're coming in without that level of experience and connection that I might have, it might come across as a little too low-key, a little bit too sedate, a little bit too lacking in deeper stakes. You might actually look at the larger film and think, well, that's it. It's a little bit underwhelming, or it might feel like it does not amp up the drama enough. But really, when it comes to a story that is more so heavily character-focused, specifically on Ewan McGregor and the relationship with his wife and daughter that he's trying desperately to hold on to, even as he feels the adult responsibilities and natural sense of distance that he carried over from his father continue on, and has to recapture the same sort of esoteric childlike wonder that comes with re-embracing the Pooh characters back into his life. That's a hard step to take, and I appreciate the subtle touches of British culture in reinforcing some of that naturally pre-built-in distance that is even a further stride that Pooh just doesn't seem to really care about. He just wanders through, befuddled through it all. And I love how so much attention was paid to the fine details and to those little pieces without having to succumb to slapstick, without having to overplay its hand. There is some of that. I think the kids will find it well enough engaged, even though I do think some of the kids might find it a little bit too low-key in its final climax. But honestly, I kind of love the final climax, if only because it pays to a very human resolution and doesn't need to fall into very supernatural methods of raising the stakes. The fact that it is such a human resolution makes it all the more relatable and touching and low-key. And again, there are points where, yeah, if you're an adult in the audience and was part of that formative generation, well, let's be thankful it's a dark theater, let's just say that, because it is one of those movies that will get you. But beyond that, for me, yeah, this is going to be one of the best movies I've seen this year. Again, I will freely admit it's more tied to my intrinsic fundamental bias. Like, it's the sort of thing that was formative to me. And it almost seems weaponized for somebody who is reaching closer to that age, going back to it now, that we would have this response. And I think this movie got the texture and the emotional through line so right that it's so easy for me to slide back into that, especially when you have such great performances. So yeah, 9 out of 10. Absolutely a must-see movie of this year. But it's also the sort of movie where I'm giving it a 9 out of 10 because it clicked so fundamentally with me, but I also am fully aware that it will not do the same for everybody else. I'd argue that kids can enjoy it, and I'd argue a certain subset of adults will really get it. But if you're more jaded, or if you're more looking for a madcap adventure or something like that, it's not going to be for you. And that's okay, because the film isn't really trying to play something that it's not. And I appreciate how honest and low-key the movie is consistently across its tone, its execution, its writing, and its direction, and so many of its performances. There's just a unity of vision of this movie that I find so incredibly compelling and genuinely moving. So yeah, it's one of the best movies of the year, and you should all definitely check it out. Trust me on it, it's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know, this is one of those movies that just got to me in a great way. I can't say it's for everybody, but my God, you're gonna wanna see it. I've got the poll up there. I'm curious how much it's gonna resonate with anybody else beyond me, but hey, I'm hoping it does, right? It's great. I'd love to see this movie do better. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to help support this channel or get involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even the top 10 list to that schedule. More details right there. Want to see my schedules? Link down there below. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.